Capacity building trumps judgmentalism. And he kind of talks about the notion that we can be very punitive with people about whether or not they're accomplishing what they should be accomplishing, or we can use sort of a notion that doesn't come from Fullen's work, but from the work of another one of my real lifetime mentors, a guy named Ogden Lindsley from the University of Kansas in the U.S. He was the father of something called precision teaching. That idea of doing 1-minute timings to find out what's happening with kids and their knowledge about what you're trying to teach them. Ogden called an error a learning opportunity, which is a nice way of putting it, right? It's capacity building. I've always found that I've learned an awful lot more about what I need to be doing next from the errors I make than from the successes I have. And I think that's really true. It's also, though, from my perspective, and this is my term on the bottom, this difference in leadership between delegating and dumping. I want to tell you the difference. This is another experience from that great experience I had in those 11 years in state government. One of the things that happens when you get a job like this job I had as a state director for all these programs is that there are people in every organization, older and younger than you are. I'm getting to the place in my career now where there's very few people that are older than I am in our organization, but back then that was not true. In fact, I got that state job a little younger than the average person got it. I wrote this letter to the state superintendent telling him what I'd do if I got the job, and he hired me, and I went, whoa, okay, now I have this job. Now, what does that mean? My specialist for learning disabilities is 20 years my senior. His name is Cy Freston. I had been the learning disability specialist for the state of Utah. So as soon as I got the job, I walked into Cy's cubicle from my office that had a door, which he always reminded me he had a cubicle that he called a lambing pen. And I had like a real office with a door. But I walked into Cy's office and I said, Cy, I've thought about what we should be doing for kids with learning disabilities in the state of Utah. Here's the plan that I have. Here's the detail of the plan. I want you to provide the leadership to get this to happen. What do you think? And after about 20 minutes of my sharing it with him, he was very respectful. I said, so what do you think, Cy? He said, Steve, you, as usual, have good ideas. That's really neat. Those are really good ideas. I only have one problem with what you've just done. And I said, what is that, Cy? What could possibly be the problem? He said, I didn't ask you for any ideas. What would you do if you were a leader and someone who worked for you said that to you? What would you do? You know who I am? I'm the state director and you're not, is one thing you could say. What I did, for some reason being very sane that day, I said, you know, you're right. I'm going to go back in my office. If you need my help, let me know. And I stood up and walked back in my office and closed the door, and my heart was really racing, and I took a deep breath and said, God, was he right? What I was doing is dumping on Cy. I was taking his responsibility away from him to decide how to best organize the LD programs in the state. What delegating is holding people accountable to outcomes and allowing them as much flexibility as you possibly can to find their own best way to accomplish it. It may not be your way, but it may be a way that gets you to the outcomes you want that particular position to accomplish. So that's the difference between delegating and dumping. That's capacity building. When people feel like they have some control over the way to get something done, that's the point. I had forgotten that wonderful Covey story that was called Green and Clean, where he was talking about empowering his son to get serious about the lawn. And what he did is he took his son out to the front yard, and the yard was a mess. They had 10 kids, and he now has 50 grandkids, by the way, Stevan Covey. But he had 10 kids, and the lawn was a mess and garbage everywhere, and it was brown. He said, son, this is not what green and clean is. He said, walk with me next door. And next door there was a house where everything was perfect, all manicured, all green. He says, this is what I want it to look like at our house. This is a non-example. That's our house. This is an example. I don't care how you do it. Go do it. If you need my help, let me know. So for the next week, he sucked it in as a dad, hoping his son would follow through. His son didn't follow through. His son went across the street to the park and played softball and just kept playing around. And so at one point, Covey was ready to kill him. And the next thing he thought was, no, I can't do that. He said to his son, so you haven't asked me for help. Do you need my help with green and clean? And the son said, you know, Dad, the reason I'm not doing anything here is that this is such a mess. I can't do this by myself. You're so busy. Do you mean really that you'd come and help clean up the garbage in our lawn so that I could actually water it? And he said, well, yeah, I mean that. Do you want to do it right now? And the son said, yes. On they went, and off they went. And the son, at that point, began to build his capacity in that delegating task that the dad did, rather than dumping on the kid. Does that make sense? So that issue, I think, is the point about capacity building that really is the key issue. So notice you have to hold a strong moral position without succumbing to moral superiority as your change strategy. It's very difficult professing or striving for something righteous to avoid self-righteousness and moral condemnation, to avoid that judgmentalism. In my spiritual journey, small s, that I'm on in my life, I can tell you that I find the most interesting continuum is the continuum between righteousness and self-righteousness. And one of the reasons I know there's God is that line moves. You think that you're being righteous, and then suddenly you get a response showing that you're being self-righteous. And when you fall over that line, you're not accomplishing what you want to accomplish. You're being ego-driven rather than spiritually driven. Does that make sense? So I think that point is a really incredibly important point for a leader, to stay on that righteous side of that continuum, even though the line moves. It makes it tough to stay there, of course. Lincoln said we can succeed only in concert, and it is not can any of us imagine better, but can we all do better is the point that Miller made in Fullen's book about this. So I like this one a lot. I think that's a great quote from Fullen. You don't make a pig fatter just by weighing it or trying to scare it into eating. For organizational or systemic change, you actually have to motivate hordes of people to do something together. That's the issue. So this purposeful interaction amongst peers is the point that Fullen is really talking about here. And so I ask this big question. This is an RTI-based question about purposeful peer interaction. I am going to have you talk as in your small groups about this. What are you doing to build your system's capacity for these issues? These are the essential issues related to RTI. The effective use of core curricula. I have noticed in my work in Canada that there is a resistance in a big way to a basic core curriculum in anything that's in a box. It's more a curricular strategy that seems to be the mode of operating. Is that true where you work or not? Yes. Rather than having a curriculum in a box or a basil in a box or something like that. And that's fine if it works. If it works. It isn't fine if it doesn't work. To suggest that an individual teacher has enough expertise to be able to meet the needs of the diversity of kids in front of that one teacher is the kiss of death for success from that approach toward curriculum. The reason a lot of systems have moved to a basal series, a core curriculum in a box, is because they recognize that some teachers are not going to be able to actually meet the needs of all the kids just by being there with the kids. So if you're not going to have something in a box, what are you doing to be able to help people to build their confidence and their expertise for a wider group of kids, for a bigger diversity of kids is the challenge you have, I think. Differentiating instruction, is obviously the key. In an RTI model that has 3 tiers, tier 1 is called universal interventions, meaning what can happen in a general classroom that is called differentiating instruction. Tier 2 is called strategic interventions. Those are short-term, individual skill-based. They really help kids to be able to get a particular skill up to speed quickly. I mentioned Anita Archer before. Her intervention teaches kids how to decode multisyllabic words. That's all it does. Because she noticed that middle school kids fail because they can't decode multisyllabic words. You see, one of the things that Shaywitz found in her research is that this is the way that the brain makes meaning. And it's a physiological fact that the brain makes meaning in the following way. The brain translates a symbol into a sound, manipulates that sound into meaning. That is not a debatable issue physically. That's the way the brain makes meaning. Some kids seem to do it so naturally you don't even see it. But at-risk readers don't do it naturally. So they have to become fluent in the decoding of a symbol into a sound in order to be able to make meaning, which is our purpose in reading. Do you get my point about that? So using the research we have to be able to help us to be able to move forward is the point of that, of course. Using progress monitoring data, problem solving, and using evidence-based academic and behavioral interventions with fidelity. So what are you doing to build your system's capacity to do all of that? Talk for the next 5 minutes, if you would, to get that conversation started. Go ahead and talk.
Instances where it's just blatantly wrong. And it keeps on coming in and saying, wow, this stuff goes on. I mean, code is like, but again, it's the there's no extra, there's no specific specification on why these things I read that. We get lucky. Like dictionary. Like the parts of
There's something similar to that. We've done one. So we find that we break down into the 3 hours. It's better.